Call of the Wild, Chapter 3, page 41. Spitz was a practiced fighter. From Spitsbergen through the Arctic and across Canada and the Barrens, he had held his own with all manner of dogs and achieved a mastery over them. Bitter rage was his, but never blind rage. In passion to rend and destroy, he never forgot that his enemy was in like passion to rend and destroy. He never rushed till he was prepared to receive a rush, never attacked till he had first defended that attack. In vain, Buck strove to sink his teeth into the neck of the big white dog. Wherever his fangs struck for the softer flesh, they were countered by the fangs of Spitz. Fang clashed fang, and lips were cut and bleeding, but Buck could not penetrate his enemy's guard. Then he warmed up and enveloped Spitz in a whirlwind of rushes. Time and time again he tried for the snow-white throat where life bubbled near to the surface, and each time and every time Spitz slashed him and got away. Then Buck took to rushing, as though for the throat, when suddenly, drawing back his head and curving it from the side, he would drive his shoulder at the shoulder of Spitz as a ram by which to overthrow him. But instead, Buck's shoulder was slashed down each time as Spitz leaped lightly away. Spitz was untouched, while Buck was streaming with blood and panting hard. The fight was growing desperate, and all the while the silent and wolfish circle waited to finish off whichever dog went down. As Buck grew winded, Spitz took to rushing, and he kept him staggering for footing. Once Buck went over, and the whole circle of 60 dogs started up, but he recovered himself almost in midair, and the circle sank down again and waited. But Buck possessed a quality that made for greatness, imagination. He fought by instinct, but he could fight by head as well. He rushed as though attempting the old shoulder trick, but at the last instant swept low to the snow and in. His teeth closed on Spitz's left foreleg. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and the white dog faced him on 3 legs. Thrice he tried to knock him over, then repeated the trick and broke his right foreleg. Despite the pain and helplessness, Spitz struggled madly to keep up. He saw the silent circle with gleaming eyes, lolling tongues, and silvery breaths drifting upward, closing in upon him, as he had seen similar circles close in upon beaten antagonists in the past. Only this time he was the one who was beaten. There was no hope for him. Buck was inexorable. Mercy was a thing reserved for gentler climes. He maneuvered for the final rush. The circle had tightened till he could feel their breaths on the huskies on his flanks. He could see them beyond Spitz and to the other side, half crouching for the spring, their eyes fixed upon him. A pause seemed to fall. Every animal was motionless, as though turned to stone. Only Spitz quivered and bristled as he staggered back and forth, snarling with horrible menace, as though to frighten off impending death. Then Buck sprang on, in and out. But while he was in, shoulder had at last squarely met shoulder. The dark circle became a dot on the moon-flooded snow as Spitz disappeared from view. Buck stood and looked on, the successful champion, the dominant primordial beast who had made his kill and found it good. Man, it's kind of sad, actually. I don't know if that makes me... I wasn't really rooting for Buck there, even though I was supposed to. I was kind of more feeling bad for Spitz the whole time. But was Spitz the one that killed Buck's friend, Curly? I think that was. That was the first time he saw the pack devour the defeated animal, who was his friend Curly. Chapter 4. Who has won the mastership? Hey, what I say? I speak true when I say dat, Buck. 2 devils. This was Francois' speech next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and by its light pointed them out. Dat Spitz fight like hell, said Perrault, as they surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. And dat Buck fight like 2 hells, was Francois' answer. And now we make good time. No more Spitz. No more trouble, sure. While Perrault packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz would have occupied as leader, but Francois, not noticing him, brought Solex to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solex was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solex in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. Look at that Buck. Him kill that Spitz. Him think to take the job. Go away, Shook, he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Solex. The old dog did not like it, and showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francois was obdurate, but when he turned his back, Buck again displaced Solex, who was not at all unwilling to go. Francois was angry. Now, by gar, I fix you, he cried, coming back with a heavy club in his hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater and retreated slowly, nor did he attempt to charge in when Solex was once more brought forward, but he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with bitterness and rage, and while he circled, he watched the club so as to dodge it if thrown by Francois, for he was become wise in the way of clubs. The driver went about his work, and he called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his old place in front of Dave. Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francois followed him up, whereupon he again retreated. After some time of this, Francois threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing, but Buck was in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have the leadership. It was by his right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perrault took a hand. Between them, they ran him about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They cursed him and his fathers and mothers before him, and all his seed to come after him down to the remotest generation, and every hair on his body and drop of blood in his veins. And he answered curse with snarl and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp, advertising plainly that when his desire was met, he would come in and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour gone. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at the courier, who shrugged his shoulders in sign that they were beaten. Then Francois went up to where Solex stood and called to Buck. Buck laughed, as dogs laugh, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Solex traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled and in an unbroken line, ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck, save at the front. Once more Francois called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. Throw down the club, Perrault commanded. Francois complied, whereupon Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened, the sled broken out, and with both men running, they dashed out onto the river trail. Highly as the dog driver had forevalued Buck with his 2 devils, he found, while the day was yet young, that he had undervalued. At a bound, Buck took up the duties of leadership, and where judgment was required, and quick thinking and quick acting, he showed himself the superior even of Spitz, of whom Francois had never seen an equal. But it was in giving the law and making his mates live up to it that Buck excelled. Dave and Solex did not mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. Their business was to toil, and to toil mightily in the traces. So long as that were not interfered with, they did not care what happened. Billy, the good-natured, could lead, for all they cared, so long as he kept order. The rest of them, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz, and their surprise was great now that Buck proceeded to lick them into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels, and who never put an ounce more of his weight against the breastband than he was compelled to do, was swiftly and repeatedly shaken for loafing. And ere the first day was done, he was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour run, was punished roundly. I think Spitz had never succeeded in doing, but Buck simply smothered him by a virtue of superior weight and cut him up till he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solidarity, and once more the dogs leaped as one in the traces. At the rink rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added, and the celerity with which Buck broke them in took away Francois's breath. "Never such a dog as that Buck," he cried. "No, never. Him worth $1,000, by gar. Eh, what you say, Perrault?" And Perrault nodded. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard, and there was no new fallen snow with which to contend. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump with but infrequent stoppages. The 30-mile river was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered in one day going out what had taken them 10 days coming in. In one run, they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake Labarge to the White Horse Rapids, across Marsh, Tagish, and Bennett, 70 miles of lakes. They flew so fast that the man whose turn it was to run towed behind the sled at the end of a rope. And on the last night of the second week, they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope with the lights of Skagway and of the shipping at their feet. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days, they had averaged 40 miles. For 3 days, Perrault and Francois threw chests up and down the main street of Skagway and were deluged with invitations to drink, while the team was a constant center of worshipful crowd of dog busters and mushers. Then 3 or 4 Western badmen aspired to clean out the town, were riddled like pepper boxes for their pains, and public interest turned to other idols. Next came official orders. Francois called Buck to him, threw his arms around him, wept over him, and that was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started Buck over the Wherry Trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind him, for this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Solex, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning, the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were underway an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of dawn. At night camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around. After the fish was eaten, for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd, 50, so like, I think 50. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised, and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel, the Mexican hairless, and Toots, the Japanese pug. But often he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity. The instincts, which were but the memories of his ancestors, became habits, which had lapsed in later days, and still later in him quickened and became alive again.